In this chapter, we will be dealing with the membranes, cellular structure, lipid bilateral membranes, membrane function and transport system. A biological membrane or biomembrane is an enclosing or separating membrane that acts as a selective barrier within or around a cell. It consists of a lipid bilayer with embedded proteins that may constitute close to 50% of the membrane content. So it is just a biomembrane enclosing or separating the membrane. The cell, which is called the, you can say that the cellular structure, the cell is the basic structural and functional unit of all non-living organisms. So it can be called the smallest unit of life that is classified as a living thing and is often called the building block of life. All cells, whether prokaryotic or eukaryotic, have a membrane that envelops the cell, separates its interior from environment, and regulates what moves in and out, and maintains the electric potential of the cell. So inside the membrane, a salty cytoplasm takes up most of the cell volume. So there are three. All cells are have got three things in common. What are they? You can call first one as cell membrane. All cells have a phospholipid based cell membrane, and cell membrane is selectively permeable in that it allows only some materials to pass on to into cells but not others. So they can be called as selectively permeable. So cytoplasm is the second one, that is cells are filled with a complex collection of a substance in a water based solution. So that substance is called cytoplasm, and of course DNA. Also, all cells contain DNA. In the simplest cells, that is DNA is in one loop, more loop-like structures free in the cytoplasm. But in some cells, such as those making up our body, the DNA is isolated from the cytoplasm in a special structure called nucleus. But remember, all cells do not have a nucleus. So the next step from the cells, you can say cell organelles. So cell organelles are the little workhouses within the cells. All the functions of life take place in each individual cell. So organelles can be released by breaking the plasma membrane through homogenization and ultracentrifuging the mixture. There are certain organelles in the cell that helps in the cellular structure. Or the organelles are of different sizes and density, and they can perform different functions. Each organelle is specified for a separate function. So in that case, we can say that nucleus is one such important organelle in our body. The nucleus is in the center of most cells. So some cells contain multiple nuclei such as skeletal muscles, while some do not have any, such as red blood cells. Specifically, you can say it is responsible for storing and transmitting the genetic information. So it is inside this that the DNA is present. The nucleus is surrounded by a selective nuclear envelope. The nuclear envelope is composed of two membranes joined at regular intervals to form a circular opening called nuclear pores. The pores allow RNA molecules and proteins modulating DNA expression to move through the pores and into the cytosol. So inside the nucleus, DNA and proteins associate to form a network of threads called chromatin. Usually chromatin becomes more vital at the time of cell division. And as it becomes tightly condensed, thus forming the rod-like chromosomes within the DNA. So inside nucleus, there's a filamentous region called the nucleolus also. So this serves as a site where the RNA and protein components of ribosomes are assembled. So nucleolus is such a filamentous region where the RNA and protein components can be assembled. Second cell organelle we are discussing is ribosomes. So ribosomes are the sites where protein molecules or proteins are synthesized from amino acids. So they are composed of proteins and RNA. So some ribosomes are found bound to the or some of the ribosomes you can find bound to the granular endoplasmic reticulum, while others are free in the, you can see, freely available, freely scattered in the cytoplasm. So proteins synthesized on ribosomes bound to granular endoplasmic reticulum are transferred from the lumen to the Golgi apparatus. Next is endoplasmic reticulum. Is collectively it is a network of membranes enclosing a singular continuous space. As mentioned earlier, granular endoplasmic reticulum, it is associated with ribosomes. So sometimes granular endoplasmic reticulum is also referred to as the smooth endoplasmic reticulum because it is associated with ribosomes. Golgi apparatus. As it is just like as it's a membranous sac that serves to modify and sort proteins into secretory or transport vesicles. So the vesicles are then delivered to the other cell organelles and the plasma membrane. So most of the cells have at least one Golgi apparatus, although some most of them have multiple, but some have just one. At least they should have one. It is actually usually it is located near the nucleus. Another important organelle, or you can say the powerhouse of the cell, can be called as the mitochondria. The mitochondria are some of the most important structures in the human body. They are the site of various chemical processes involved in the synthesis of energy packets called ATP, that is adenosine triphosphate. Each mitochondrium is surrounded by two membranes, that is the outer membrane, and while outer membrane it is smooth, while the inner membrane it is a bit uh, it has some tubular structures inside it. So those structures are called as cristae. So mitochondria are unique in that they contain small amounts of DNA containing the genes for the synthesis of some mitochondrial proteins. Same as the lysosomes are also bound by a single membrane and it contain highly acidic fluid. So these lysosomes play an important form in the cell, form of main like plays an important role in the cells of immune system. Peroxisomes are also bound by a single membrane. They consume oxygen and work to drive they work to drive reactions in the that remove hydrogen from various molecules in the form of hydrogen peroxide. But peroxisomes are important in maintaining the chemical balance within the cell. There are also cytoskeleton present. It can be also called as a cell organelle, as a filamentous network of proteins that are associated with the processes that maintain and change the cell shape and produce cell movements and all. Usually, the cytoskeleton can be there are three types of filaments in it. It is microfilaments, microtubules, and microfilaments, intermediate filaments, and microtubules. Of this, the microtubules are hollow tubules with composed of protein called tubulin, and they are the thickest and most rigid of the filaments. That is the most rigid that gives the cytoskeleton that rigid structure. So those are the three. Lipid bilayer membranes. The lipid bilayer it is a thin polar membrane. It is made up of two layers of lipid molecules actually. So these membranes are flat sheets that form a continuous barrier around cells. And the cell membrane of almost all living organisms and many viruses are made up of a lipid bilayer. It is the barrier that keep ions, proteins, and other molecules. They prevent them from diffusing into areas where they should not go. So lipid bilayers are ideally suited to this role because even though they are only a few nanometers in width, they are impermeable to most water-soluble molecules. So it can act as a barrier. Natural bilayers are usually composed of phospholipids, which have a hydrophilic head and two hydrophobic tails. So when phospholipids are exposed to water, they arrange themselves into a two-layered sheet, or you can say it's a bilayer, with all other tails pointing toward the center of the sheet. The center of this bilayer contains almost no water or excludes molecules like sugars or salts that dissolve water but not in oil. The best example for lipid bilayer membrane was given by the fluid mosaic model. It describes the plasma membrane of animal cells in which they surround these two layers, that is bilayer of phospholipid and which has hydrophobic and hydrophilic ends. Membrane functions and membrane proteins. The cell membrane surrounds the cytoplasm of a cell and in animal cells physically separates the intracellular components from the extracellular environment. The membrane is also selectively permeable and they are able to regulate what enters and exits the cells, so thus facilitate the transport of materials needed for the survival. So the movement of substances across the membrane can either be passive, occurring without the input of cellular energy, or active, requiring the cell to expand energy in transporting it. Transmembrane protein channels and nutrients such as sugars or amino acids must enter the cell and certain products of metabolism must be used. So such molecules are pumped across the membrane by transmembrane transporters, or you can say transmembrane proteins, or diffuse through the that can diffuse through the protein channels. Membrane proteins, like what type of membrane proteins are responsible for this, which helps in the channeling, in between the channeling of substances. So a membrane protein is a protein molecule that is attached to or associated with the membrane of a cell or an organelle. It can be either a cell or an organelle. So more than half of all proteins interact with membranes, and membrane proteins, they can be in turn divided into like integral, the place where they are present can be divided into is integral membrane protein, integral membrane protein. So these are the proteins that are permanently attached to the membrane. So they can be these permanently attached to membrane, the proteins which are permanently attached to the membrane, they can be classified into the relationship with the bilayer as integral polytopic proteins. It can be also known as transmembrane proteins. So they are permanently attached to the lipid membrane and span across the membrane at least once they span. So the transmembrane regions of the proteins are either beta barrels or alpha helical. So integral monotypic proteins are proteins that are permanently attached to the lipid membrane. That not unlike integral polytopic proteins, they do not, at least once they do not cross the membrane. So they are permanently attached to the lipid membrane and from only one side, and they do not span across the membrane. Second type of membranes that you can see in the channels is peripheral membrane protein. Peripheral membrane proteins are temporarily associated with lipid bilayer or with integral membrane proteins. Peripheral membrane proteins can also be called as extrinsic proteins because they are present on the peripheral or the extrinsic side of the membrane. They do not interact with the hydrophobic core of the lipid bilayer. That's why they are called peripheral proteins, because they stay always on the outside of the cell membrane. They interact with membrane indirectly by binding to the integral membrane proteins. So peripheral membrane proteins are temporarily attached either to the lipid bilayer or to integral proteins by a combination of hydrophobic or elastostatics and other non-covalent interactions. So transport system. What type of or what kind of a system can be used for transportation of these proteins inside the membranes? So there are various types of transport systems available. We can discuss one by one. So passive transport. A molecule or ion that crosses the membrane by moving down a concentration or an electrochemical gradient and without expenditure of metabolic energy. That is, they are not using the metabolic energy to cross the cross the membrane, and it's transported and is said to be transported passively. So another name for this process can be called as, more familiar name is diffusion. So all molecules and ions in constant motion, and it is the energy of motion, kinetic energy, that drives the passive transport. So diffusion, in simple diffusion, how molecules have a natural tendency to move and spread out evenly in any available space. So that can be called as simple diffusion. An example would be like if you drop a dye in a section of beaker and separated by a permeable membrane. In that case, the dye that is more randomly, they will move to net movement across the membrane such that the concentration of the dye on both sides will be equal. So such form of flow can be called as diffusion. That is a type of simple diffusion. It occurs naturally, but there is facilitated diffusion also. So another form of passive transport where many polar molecules diffuse with the help of integral proteins in the lipid bilayer. So the two main types of this kind of transports are ion channels and gated channels. They are mostly used, facilitated diffusion you can see mostly in ion channels and gated channels. So in the case of ion channels, the protein spans the lipid bilayer, has a chain with like polar R group or polar R amino group, which allows small polar molecules to passively diffuse down the concentration gradient of the cell. Another type of transport system is osmosis. It is a special case of passive transport actually. So in osmosis, what happens is that water diffuses from a hypotonic, that is low solute concentration solution to a hypertonic, that is high solute concentration solution. Water is diffusing from a hypertonic to a hypotonic to a hypertonic solution. So generally speaking, the direction of water flow is determined by the solute concentration and not by the nature of the solute molecules themselves. Like for example, if the blood cells uh, are placed in salt water solutions or different concentration solutions. So if the salt water solution is hypertonic, then it would contain a higher concentration of solute and a lower concentration of water than the blood cells. But if the salt water is isotonic, that is, it is neutral, the concentration and if it is isotonic, it would contain the same concentration of solute as the blood cells. But if the water solution is, if the salt water solution is hypertonic, it would contain a low concentration of solute and a high concentration of water than the blood cells. So in that terms, you can say that osmosis can happen in these ways. Last without the active transport system. So in all this, like the systems which we discussed now, like the passive stress diffusion or facilitated division of osmosis, all this, the amount of energy involved is less. So in order to control its internal environment, a cell must often expend energy to substances into or out of the cell. So energy required in active transport process, in which a cell moves a substance across the membrane from a region of lower concentration to a region of higher concentration. So obviously some energy is involved. In other words, they can say that the cell moves the substance against its concentration gradient. So anything that goes against the usual flow, it means some energy should be applied. So some energy is used in that. So energy is supplied by the ATP, that is adenosine triphosphate, and is used to make the transport protein change its three-dimensional shape, transferring the molecules or ions across the membrane in the process. So by changing the shape of the proteins, they are facilitating them to go into the next medium. So such type, active transport systems can be usually this type of system is used in sodium potassium pumps, uh, and because it is known that cells contain high concentration of potassium ions but low concentration of sodium ions. Therefore, it was deduced that protein existed on the plasma membrane which actively pumped two ions against the biological gradients. These are the core or the active transport system and passive transport system are used in the movement of membrane proteins.